Welcome back to the deep dive. All right, so today we're going deep on geopolitics. More specifically, some pretty wild predictions from this Polish psychic, Krzysztof Jackowski.
Jackowski.
Yeah, you guys sent us his recent YouTube video, and let me tell you, this is some out there stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking potential power shifts, new alliances, even hints of like a new era of colonialism. So, expert speaker, are you ready to unpack all this?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember right off the bat that predicting the future, especially when it comes to international relations, is it's a tricky business.
For sure.
But even if we take these predictions with a grain of salt, Jackowski's ideas give us a really interesting way to think about some of the major trends and potential flashpoints that are out there.
Okay, so let's get into it. Jackowski really focuses on this idea of a poker game happening between these four major players: Netanyahu, Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping.
Right.
And he says that Trump is about to make this huge move that totally flips the script on traditional American foreign policy.
Yeah. This is where things get really interesting. Jackowski claims that Trump is going to prioritize a strong alliance with Russia. And that could even mean sidelining Europe in the process.
Ooh.
Now, think about that for a second.
Yeah.
It'd be a dramatic shift from how things have been since World War II.
Yeah.
You know, the U.S. and Europe have been pretty much inseparable, especially through organizations like NATO.
Right. NATO, for those who might not be totally up to speed,
Yeah.
that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed way back in 1949 as like a military alliance, primarily to counter the Soviet Union. The whole idea is collective defense. If one member gets attacked, it's like all of them get attacked.
Right, an attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if Jackowski is right and this alliance crumbles, what happens to global security? Does it become every country for itself?
That's the million-dollar question.
Mm-hmm.
And Jackowski says that this new U.S.-Russia partnership will be all about controlling and exploiting resources, particularly in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Yeah.
He even quotes Trump saying, small countries don't matter in this new world order. So if that's the mindset, then ideas like collective defense could go right out the window.
And that's where this whole colonialism thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
Powerful countries calling the shots, grabbing resources, and leaving smaller nations with basically no say.
Right.
He even suggests that Canada might think about becoming a U.S. state just to get a piece of the Arctic action.
Yeah, the term colonialism obviously has a lot of historical baggage.
Of course.
And for good reason. Yeah, it refers to one country exploiting another for its resources, its labor, and often even its strategic location. Think about how European powers carved up Africa and Asia back in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not what Jackowski's describing is a direct parallel to that is debatable.
Sure.
But the idea of these powerful nations asserting their dominance and just taking resources definitely raises some serious red flags.
No doubt. And it's not just about land and resources either. Jackowski also says that Trump might pressure Poland to settle debts related to Jewish property restitution, which is a super complex and sensitive issue.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I mean, this goes back to property loss during the Holocaust. And it's been a point of contention between Poland and Israel for decades.
For sure.
Bringing this up would be a huge power play, potentially forcing Poland to choose between its relationship with the U.S. and its own domestic political situation.
Absolutely. It shows how, in this scenario, economic pressure could become a major tool for larger countries to wield over smaller ones.
Okay, so we've got this potential U.S.-Russia alliance, a mad grab for resources, and smaller nations caught in the crossfire. What about the other big player in this geopolitical poker game? China. What's their role in all of this?
Well, according to Jackowski, China's watching all of this very, very carefully. They're not exactly thrilled about this potential U.S.-Russia power couple.
Right.
And they could be gearing up for a countermove. Jackowski even suggests that they might threaten war if they feel threatened by this new alliance.
So we've got a three-way standoff, everyone eyeing each other suspiciously, holding their cards close to their chest. But if we look at history and what's happening in the world right now, how likely is it that these predictions could actually play out?
That's the big question, and it's something we'll need to unpack more. But before we do, let's take a closer look at what Jackowski says about this potential new world order. He claims that NATO, which we talked about earlier, might be dissolved completely and replaced with something else.
Okay, now hold on a second. NATO has definitely faced challenges in recent years.
Yeah.
Some members haven't been keeping up with their defense spending commitments,
Right.
and there have been disagreements about strategic priorities. So could there be some truth to this idea that NATO is becoming obsolete, or at least needs a serious overhaul?
There's definitely a conversation to be had about NATO's future.
Yeah.
Some argue that it needs to adapt to new threats, like cyber warfare and terrorism, and that it needs to be more flexible in how it responds. But Jackowski takes it a step further, claiming that this new alliance will be way more exclusive, potentially excluding countries like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia.
Whoa. So basically, any country that Russia might see as a potential threat would be left out in the cold. That's
Yeah.
a pretty chilling thought.
Yeah, it is. And it raises all kinds of questions about what will happen to global security. Would this new alliance be as effective as NATO?
Right.
Could it really deter aggression from countries like Russia or China? Would it even be stable in the long run?
So many unknowns. Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down Jackowski's predictions a little more. He doesn't just offer these vague ideas, he actually gives some pretty vivid pictures of how this new world order might play out.
Right. He uses some pretty striking imagery and specific anecdotes to illustrate his points.
Yeah.
For example, he describes this scene where Trump basically treats the Polish president with total disdain, really emphasizing that idea of small countries don't matter. He even says that the meeting between them was incredibly short, driving that point home.
Like a scene straight out of a political thriller.
Right.
This powerful leader completely dismissing the concerns of a smaller nation, just focused on his own agenda. But is this just dramatic storytelling? Or could it be a glimpse into a future that's closer than we think?
That's the question we need to grapple with. And to do that, we need to dig deeper into the potential motivations and strategies of each player in this whole geopolitical game. What are their goals? What are their fears? What are their potential breaking points?
Okay, so let's start with Trump. What's driving him, according to Jackowski? Is it pure ambition, a desire to grab resources, or something else entirely?
Jackowski suggested Trump's main goal is to reassert American dominance on the world stage.
Yeah.
But not in the way we've traditionally seen it. He paints this picture of Trump as someone who sees the world in very transactional terms. It's all about deal making, securing resources, and just consolidating power. And he believes that aligning with Russia, even if it's just temporary, is the best way to achieve those goals.
That's a pretty huge shift from the usual U.S. approach of trying to contain Russian influence. It makes you wonder, what does Putin get out of this deal? I mean, he's not exactly known for being a pushover.
Right. Jackowski portrays Putin as a master strategist, always thinking a few moves ahead.
Yeah.
He suggests that Putin sees this alliance as a way to get back some of the influence Russia lost when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah.
Basically restoring them to great power status.
So is it just like a temporary alliance of convenience?
Yeah.
Are they both just using each other, hoping to come out on top in the end?
That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
And it kind of highlights how unstable this predicted world order could be.
Yeah.
Jackowski doesn't see this U.S.-Russia thing as some kind of unshakable friendship.
Right.
It's more like a high-stakes poker game where both players are bluffing and trying to outmaneuver each other.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, this alliance does happen. Where are the potential flashpoints? Where could things blow up?
Jackowski points to a few key areas.
Yeah.
First, there's the Arctic.
Of course.
As the ice caps melt, access to resources and shipping routes up there is becoming more and more valuable.
Yeah.
And it's a region where both Russia and the U.S. have big interests.
It's easy to see how that competition for resources could lead to tension and even conflict, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if this new world order is all about might-may-makes, right?
Exactly. And then there's the Middle East. Jackowski says that Netanyahu is actually a key player in all of this.
Yeah.
Pushing for NATO to be dissolved and this new, more exclusive alliance to be created. Wait, hold on. Why would Netanyahu want to dismantle NATO? Isn't that alliance supposed to protect its members, including Israel, from outside threats?
Well, Jackowski doesn't really explain Netanyahu's motivations in detail,
Okay.
but he suggests that Netanyahu sees NATO as outdated, like it's not really serving Israel's interests anymore. He predicts that Netanyahu wants a new alliance that's more focused on countering Iran and other threats in the region.
So it's all about shifting alliances based on changing priorities and perceived threats. It makes you wonder if any alliance can really last in this kind of cutthroat geopolitical environment.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And one of the most unsettling predictions Jackowski makes is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He uses this phrase, throw out the trash, which he says is something Netanyahu said.
Wow.
And he suggests it's referring to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
If that's true, that would be a serious escalation of the conflict, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And with this potential U.S.-Russia alliance changing the balance of power in the region, the consequences could be even more devastating.
It's a really disturbing thought. And it shows how these kinds of geopolitical shifts can have a direct impact on people's lives, especially those who are already living in conflict zones.
Okay, so we've talked about the Arctic, the Middle East, and the potential for things to get really messy. But there's one more piece of the puzzle. China. What does Jackowski say about their role in all of this?
Jackowski suggests that China is the wild card in this whole scenario. He claims they're watching this U.S.-Russia alliance very closely with a lot of suspicion and concern, and they might be willing to do something drastic to protect their own interests. He even says that China could threaten war if they see this new alliance as a direct threat to their ambitions.
That's a pretty big if, though, right?
Yeah.
China has a lot to lose if they start a war, especially with a country like the U.S. They're so connected economically.
That's true.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore the fact that China has been building up its military a lot in recent years. They've been modernizing their forces, developing advanced weapons systems, and projecting their power further and further out, particularly in the South China Sea.
Right, and they've been more assertive about their claims in the South China Sea.
Exactly.
Which has already led to tensions with neighboring countries and with the U.S.
Right. And Jackowski specifically mentions Taiwan as a potential flashpoint. He suggests that if China sees an opportunity, maybe while the U.S. is busy with this new alliance with Russia, they might try to take control of Taiwan.
Okay, so let's break down this Taiwan situation for a second.
Sure.
Taiwan has been self-governing since 1949, but China has never ruled out using force to bring it under its control. It's a situation that could easily spark a major international conflict, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Taiwan is a major player in the global tech industry. Any conflict there would have huge economic consequences. Plus, it would likely draw in other major powers, like Japan and Australia,
Yeah.
which would escalate things even further.
And if the U.S. is already tied up in this alliance with Russia, how would they respond to a Chinese move on Taiwan? Would they be willing to risk a direct military confrontation with China?
That's the big question.
Wow.
And no one can really answer it for sure, but it's definitely something that people in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow are thinking about right now.
It's a pretty scary thought. The idea that these geopolitical power plays could turn into a full-blown global conflict.
It's definitely a reminder of how fragile the world order is and how quickly things can change.
So, if even some of what Jackowski's predicting is accurate, what does this mean for smaller nations like Poland? They're caught between these superpowers with very little room to move.
Yeah, it's like they're stuck in this geopolitical tug of war.
Right.
On one side, you have the U.S. maybe pulling back on security guarantees and demanding stuff. And on the other side, you have Russia looming over everything with their own plans.
Exactly. Jackowski paints a pretty bleak picture for Poland. He says they could face pressure from both sides.
Yeah.
He predicts that Trump might pull troops out of Poland and even use that whole issue of Jewish property restitution as leverage to get what he wants. It's almost like Poland becomes a pawn in this big geopolitical chess game.
And it's not just Poland either, right?
Nope.
Other smaller countries in Eastern Europe, especially the ones that used to be part of the Soviet Union, could find themselves in a similar situation. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the ones Jackowski specifically mentioned as possibly being left out of this new alliance, would probably feel really vulnerable.
Yeah.
They've relied on NATO to protect them from Russia for decades. And without that, they'd be in a much riskier position.
It's like the whole idea of collective security just disappears.
Right.
If powerful countries can just decide who their allies are based on what's convenient for them or what benefits them, what does that mean for international cooperation?
That's a really important question. And it goes beyond just military alliances. If this might-makes-right world that Jackowski is describing actually happens, it could affect all kinds of international agreements and institutions, from trade deals to climate accords.
So it's not just about who has the biggest army or the most resources. It's also about who controls the narrative, who gets to make the rules.
Exactly. And in a world where power is shifting and alliances are breaking down, it's more important than ever to understand what's motivating these key players. What are they after? What are they afraid of? Where are their limits?
Okay, so let's step back for a minute and look at the bigger picture. What about the global economy? How would these geopolitical shifts affect trade, investment, and financial markets?
Well, it's hard to imagine a situation where more geopolitical instability leads to a better economy.
Right.
If anything,
Yeah.
Jackowski's predictions point to a world where economic competition gets even fiercer as these major powers fight for resources and market share.
Yeah, we're already seeing the economic fallout from the war in Ukraine. Supply chains are messed up, energy prices are skyrocketing, and there's a lot of uncertainty in global markets.
So sure.
And if these other potential conflicts happen, the impact could be way worse.
Exactly. And it's not just about the direct economic impacts,
Yeah.
like disruptions to trade or sanctions.
Yeah.
It's also about the erosion of trust and cooperation, which is what the whole global economic system is built on.
Mm-hmm.
If countries are constantly fighting for a position and only looking out for themselves, it becomes much harder to deal with shared challenges, like climate change or pandemics.
So it's like this vicious cycle.
Right.
Geopolitical instability leads to economic uncertainty, which then fuels more tension and mistrust, making it even harder to find common ground and solve global problems. It's a pretty grim picture.
It's not the most optimistic outlook, but it's important to remember that predictions aren't set in stone.
True.
The future isn't predetermined. Our actions can still shape what happens.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom, but we have to remember that we have the power to make choices and influence outcomes.
Absolutely. And that starts with being informed, thinking critically, and questioning assumptions. Jackowski's predictions, whether we agree with them or not, give us a chance to really step back and look at what's happening in the world, to ask tough questions and consider different viewpoints.
And ultimately, to think about what kind of future we want to build. It's a reminder that we're not just watching this global drama unfold. We're part of it, and our choices matter.
That's a great way to put it. This isn't just about predicting the future, it's about shaping it.
Well, expert speaker, this deep dive has been both fascinating and a little unsettling. We've covered a lot, from potential power shifts and new alliances to the possibility of conflict and economic instability. It's a lot to take in, but it's important information for anyone who wants to understand what's happening in the world.
I agree. It's been great talking about these complex issues with you. I think it highlights how important it is to stay informed, have these kinds of conversations, and be open to different ways of thinking.
Absolutely. And with that, we want to leave you with one final thought. Jackowski focuses on what world leaders are doing, but how might these geopolitical changes affect you, your community, your everyday life? What opportunities and challenges might come up? What role can you play in creating a future that's more peaceful, prosperous, and just? These are questions we're thinking about as we navigate this rapidly changing world.
Well said. It's a reminder that we're all part of this global story, and we all have a stake in how it turns out.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring.